We're so delighted to have Florence Cobb with us, who flew in from Paris, especially for this. We had her for a different conversation this morning on GCC Maghreb relations, and now we're so happy to be able to host this conversation around her book. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it or look at it, but Florence will give us a kind of a wonderful introduction to it today. We did send the link to the book if you'd like to purchase it in our last email out to you. So please check that out, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading it. The conversation will be moderated by my colleague Hussein Ibish today, so I'll hand over the floor to him. And please enjoy. Thank you.
And greetings to everyone out there who's streaming. I know several people who are streaming, and we're delighted to have you with us via the internet. So today we're going to discuss the contents and the general subject of the new book by Florence Gaub, who's been kind enough, as Raymond said, to come all the way from Paris to be with us to discuss her new book, which is really excellent, called Guardians of the Arab State, When Militaries Intervene in Politics from Iraq to Mauritania. And it's essentially, in the title gives you a sense of the geographical scope of the study, but also there's an impressive chronological scope as well. It sort of looks at the phenomenon of the political role, or lack thereof, in some cases, potentiality but unrealized, of Arab militaries in the Arab world in the modern era. So it really does go back to the foundings of the contemporary Arab state system in the 20s and slightly before that. So before we get into the book itself, let me just tell you, and you have more detail in your little form here, but a little booklet that we've made, that Florence is a senior analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, where she heads the Middle East and North Africa program, and she focuses on conflict strategy and security, particularly in Iraq, Lebanon, and Libya, which are, of course, sites of three of the more significant conflicts in the Middle East, especially so far as Lebanon is connected to Syria, and the conflicts in Lebanon are connected to the one in Syria. Military forces, conflict structures, and geostrategic dimensions of the Arab region. And she's worked before at the NATO Defense College and the German Parliament, and regularly testifies at government hearings and parliamentary hearings. She's got a PhD from Humboldt University and from Sorbonne and Munich universities also, and she teaches at Sciences Po. So it's really great to have you here. Again, if you haven't read this, you really must. And the first step is to go and buy it. So I encourage everyone to, worth your pennies. Right? I can testify to that. So I'd like to begin by asking Florence to describe the book a little bit, and also anything that has come up for her after the text was finalized. So if you think that you can go beyond a little, that would be fine. Then I'll have a response. We'll have a little dialogue, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I'll hand it over to you, and if you can tell us a bit about this excellent book, which can be bought, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Hussein. You laugh, but this is Arab military forces is a bit of now everybody talks about it. But when I started working on this back in 2003, nobody cared. So the group of people that worked on Arab military forces, we all know each other by first name. So I never expected this book to sell. I still don't, in huge quantities, because it's such a specialized issue. Now, luckily, the Arab Spring happened, so maybe that changes it a little bit. To explain how this book came into being, my PhD was on multi-ethnic armed forces after after a civil war. And Lebanon was one of the countries that I looked at. And so I came from an angle that's a bit unusual for a political scientist, in that I tried to get a look into the institutions. How do they absorb a political shock institutionally? So I studied political science, but my approach to this has been multidisciplinary in nature, because obviously you have to go into the military and then back out again to see how it interconnects with society. And so this was my first encounter, so to speak, with military forces in the region. I then started working at NATO Defense College in the Middle East faculty, where they had an outreach program for the Arab countries that NATO is a partner of. And so I was engaging with Arab military officers on a daily basis, which led me in March 2013 to writing an article called Egypt, Countdown to a Coup d'etat. And I was surprised myself that I was right to the point that it happened a few months later. And I started developing essentially an understanding of how Arab military forces think as a collective. And then Hearst contacted me and said, why don't you write a book about everything that you know? So essentially the real title isn't Guardians of the Arab State, but everything that Florence knows about Arab military forces. And so the key question that this book tries to answer is why? Why do Arab military forces become involved in politics? Since 1945, there have been 73 coup attempts in the region. I think about 39 have been successful, the rest not. So a little over half of them are actually managed to change government policy or government writ large. I looked a little beyond the coups because I think we need to understand this topic broader. Every time a military force as a collective decided to influence policy, I decided to include that in my analysis, not necessarily a coup, which is arguably the most invasive form. So 3/4 of Arab states have seen coup d'etats, and virtually every decade. So it's not a thing of the past, because that's, I think, a bit the Western perception that this is a 1960s phenomenon. We still see it very, very much. Well, obviously the last one was in 2013 in Egypt. So basically I read every little detail I could find, not only the obvious ones, but ranging from what ranks did the officers had that intervened, to salaries in Arab military forces, to what kind of weapons they use, to really gather everything that I could find into one book. And essentially, I think most books that people write are the ones that they would have liked to read themselves. And I wanted to have one book that actually says everything that there is to know. The backdrop to this is that while a lot has been published, especially since 2011, on why Arab military forces behaved the way they did in 2011, there is almost nothing, or there is nothing really, that goes all the way back to try and understand the phenomenon. And there is a bit of a battle amongst political scientists when it comes to explanations for why military forces engage in politics. And I decided not to take sides in that sense. I think actually it's more complex, and that all the reasons are interlinked in building on each other. So the first reason is because they can. If a military force can't, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by that, there simply won't be intervention in politics. And if they can, and they want to as well, then you have the next preconditions. So these are two military intrinsic reasons, but if they can but they don't want to, you will not have intervention, obviously. So these are the two military intrinsic reasons. Then there are two military extrinsic reasons, which are related to the society and the state that they operate in. The first being because there is nobody else. In other words, the civilians in these states are not performing in the way that they could or should. So there is nobody who could push them back when they're capable and willing to act. And the last point is because they are allowed to act. So there is actually a push and a pull, if you see my point. Pushing from inside the military, but also a pull from the environment that they operate in. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So the first thing is because they can. For those of you, do we have military officers here today? No, perfect. So I can explain to you what civilians don't understand. Essentially, what makes a military force capable of waging war is also what makes it capable of staging a coup. Namely, the capacity to mobilize a large group of people in a collective fashion into one direction. So I have one general at the top. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's trickled down through the officer corps and then mobilized into the soldiers, which means that you can actually move thousands of people into one direction, a bit like a hive mind, if you want to put it that way. That's where the military is different from the police, because the police might also have weapons, but the police cannot move in the same collective fashion. They're not built for that. Police forces never deploy in the ranges of the thousands. So that's That's, I think, the first thing. So the collective action, obviously firepower as well, but you could argue police also has firepower, never stages coups. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, believe it or not, but to stage a coup, it's actually quite simple to do. You don't need that many people. When we say the military ousted someone from government, it's actually a bit misleading because it's usually only a small portion of the military that does that. In pure numbers, it depends on the coups, but I found between 3 and 15% of an officer corps involved in a coup. Mm-hmm. So that's a very low number. You had coups in the region where overall only 2% of the armed forces, so officers and soldiers together, actually staged a coup. In military unit terms, it can be 1 battalion, so that's like 1,000 soldiers, up to a brigade, so 3,000 to 5,000. That's all you need. The coup d'état in Iraq in 1958 was actually performed with 2 brigades. One arrested the royal family, and the other took the radio station, and that was it. And the monarchy was done. So that's actually a small number of people. There is a book called Coup d'État Manual, which has been read by many African and Arab leaders, but essentially summarizes that. So you need only a small amount, but it's crucial that they're in the right units. Okay, so it's not enough to have 15 guys that want to stage a coup, let's say in supplies. They usually have to be in signals, in logistics, but also in certain infantry units. So of course, the higher the rank of the officers involved, the higher the chance that all of the armed forces, the whole collective, will act together. So 2013 in Egypt is one such example, where it's actually really the generals that got involved. But the vast majority of coups in the region are actually conducted by colonels. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you obviously remember Abdel Nasser, who was a colonel. Gaddafi, by the way, was not a colonel. He was a major who promoted himself to colonel afterwards. Mm-hmm. But why colonels? Colonels is the rank where frustration meets capacity. Yeah. So capacity meaning a colonel, usually depending on where he's in the armed forces, has large enough units under his command to actually stage a coup. So he will command a brigade or a battalion or even larger. But the difference between him and the general is that he's very frustrated because he's not a general. Right. Once you're a general, you have achieved the highest rank possible, you have a lot to lose. A colonel has actually, if he places the bets right, he has a lot to win from a coup. So the colonels are the ones that you need in such a case. Now, I said because they can. What happens if they can't? You're going to ask me, are there actually forces that can't? And yes, they are. It's a technique called coup-proofing, right? So imagine yourself to be a political leader, and you know that if your army is really good at its job, i.e. fighting wars, they actually might be a threat to you. So you might make the political concession for yourself. You're going to weaken their military capacity to protect yourself from them militarily, a technique we call coup-proofing. So you weaken the officer corps, you weaken cohesion, you keep them short. If you're Saddam Hussein, you execute them randomly so that they get really scared of you. They don't even think of ousting you, and so forth. Now, the problem is that this has a price. It has an effectiveness price, which we've seen in Libya in 2011, where the Libyan military virtually melted away, save for those units that were actually allowed to be cohesive and trained. Also in Iraq in 2014. In Mosul, where Maliki coup-proofed the military to death in that sense. So it's a bit unfair to say that the Iraqi army failed the government. I think it's rather the reverse. Yeah. So first reason, because they can. So let's say they can. Will they want to is the second question. I found, this is a larger debate, but I'm sure you've seen the what we call the communiqué number 1, the first declaration an armed force usually releases after a coup. It's always all about nationalism, saving the nation, yada, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. That might actually be really the case, but the real motivation is not saving the nation. It's usually very military intrinsic reasons. And these reasons are, what's interesting about that, are really collective motivation. So it's not a single officer wanting more money, it's because the institution as a whole has suffered from whatever the civilians were doing. That can be low military spending, that can be waging a war without taking into account the officer corps in the decision-making process, that can be small in size. You will laugh, but the smaller an army is in size, the likelier it is to stage a coup, which is a bit counterintuitive because especially in the West we think small and agile means it's less threatening. In Libya in '69 the military was I think 5,000, small, really small. So in terms of military spending, it's the same. The less actually of a civilian government spent on its military, the more likely they were to stage a coup. And when it comes to war, you will find that in most cases there was a conflict before where the military felt let down by the government. So in Egypt, for instance, 1956, there was the war of 1948 against Israel. Nasser wrote it in his diary. We sat in the trenches, we had no guns, we had no ammunition, and they let us do the dirty job. And then when we come home, we're going to be punished by the public because they think we lost the war when it really was the government that didn't give us what we needed. So what happens when you have a military organization that is capable but not interested in acting? You get the cases of, for instance, Lebanon or Tunisia, that would both be, in purely military cohesiveness terms, be able to remove the government, but they don't have a reason to do that because they are independent enough, they're funded enough, they have what they need, so as a collective, they won't act. But for those who want to and can, they might become a danger if, and now we move to the outside of it, if the surroundings are not well protected. In a sense, I called it because there's nobody else. What I mean by that is that the civilians interact with the military not in a constructive fashion. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the civil-military relations debate. What are civil-military relations really? Is it civilian control? Actually, it's not so much control because you can never really control a military force. If you try that as a civilian, you're very likely to weaken them to the inside. Instead, the civilians and the military need to constructively work together on defense of the country. And in a democracy, it's obviously the civilians which have the last word. But there's a lot of gray. There's a pretty big gray area. Now, in the region, there are no procedures or no rules for how civilians and military interact. Now, in this country, you have Congress involved, you have a civilian defense ministry, you have all kinds of institutions, you have civil society that are actually part of this larger debate. In the region, well, where you have parliaments, the defense committees don't play any role. The ministries are usually staffed by military themselves, and overall, the relations are made up of distrust. Now, what weakens, so number one, if the civilians don't interact constructively with the military, they will be weakened in the relationship. But secondly, they are normally also weakened if they lack legitimacy. Legitimacy doesn't have to be democratically elected, but it means that there is a broad consensus in society that these are our leaders. And there's a very interesting case in Jordan. King Hussein, in the late 1960s, there was an attempted coup against him, but parts of the military actually allied with him. These were those parts of the military that were largely from the eastern part of Jordan, from the Bedouin tribes, that saw not only the military as theirs, but also King Hussein as the legitimate leader. So they actually, it was an inner military fight, and King Hussein won this fight on the grounds that he was seen as the legitimate leader. Where you're not seen as a legitimate leader, like the Iraqi monarchy, for instance, in '58, Morsi's legitimacy was quite questionable at the time of the coup, at least in the eye of certain people, then the military can simply remove you without there being any reaction by the public. Okay, so it's true that cases like Hussein's, they're quite rare, but you can, as a military force, if you're willing and capable to act, you will have to take into consideration what the public thinks about the civilians that you're trying to remove. And if you are on bad terms with them, you have to take that into account. And this brings me to my last point, and I think it's the one that you probably hear most about. It's the strongest pull factor because you're allowed to, because they're allowed to by the people. And here, obviously, at the current stage, this would be Algeria and Egypt, where there is a public approval for intervention. I mean, we had, I think, 1 million signatures for Sisi to run for president, before he even ran, shortly after the coup. There is manipulation excluded. There is a strong desire or a strong possibility to call on the military to change a government that you don't like. This happens, of course, in systems where democratic change or change writ large doesn't occur naturally, and in that case, the military is drawn into the political sphere. So it goes both ways. In addition, what's a bit absurd, or I think some Western analysts laugh about that, because they confuse public approval with military performance. There is a really large, really broad support, 80 to 90% appreciation of Arab military forces across different countries. So there are different surveys done. I've seen multiple different sources, pretty much across the region, everywhere, even in Iraq, where the military obviously is not doing so well in purely military tactical terms, the rate of approval is very high. So that's something I think we don't understand necessarily, because we think if they're not performing militarily, surely nobody likes them. That's because, and this gets a bit more symbolic now, they represent, of course, the nation, nationalism. They stand above party politics, which, divisive politics in the region are a real issue. There's also it's a bit outdated now, but in the 60s there was this whole body of literature, modernization theory, which posited that the military would lift, single-handedly a country out of backwardness, and this is actually a quote, would lift the societies out of backwardness and into modernity. I think that's itself not true, but it is still true today that of all the governmental institutions, Arab military forces have the highest rate of approval, regardless of how well they do in military terms. So that is something they can capitalize on, and they do at times. Okay. However, and I'll end on that note, what is appreciated is the military as an arbiter between society and the government. It is appreciated as a symbol of the nation and so forth. It is not appreciated, actually, when it's in power. So this is the real risk for military forces, is that they confuse this public affection with a call to actually be in power themselves. In Egypt in 2012, you might remember when the SCAF briefly held the reins, they came out of this experience really bruised. And you can see in general that when Arab military forces stage coups, they don't do it anymore in the way that Gaddafi or Nasser did it, in the sense that they really ruled themselves. Yeah. There is a preference to let civilians rule but control behind the scenes. And I think we still see that, and 2013 was a very good example for how the Egyptian military had learned from the 2012 experience, when it became quite anti-military throughout that year, and it prefers to be behind the scenes and control certain things. One last element that I call it a fun fact, although it's actually not that funny, but is that once a military ruler is in power, it's mostly will civilianize. In the sense that Sisi today, when you read in the news the military strongman, well, he is no longer in the military. There will be a gradual separation of him from the institution. And that is something you could see in all the cases that I have studied. That Mubarak, for instance. Mubarak was an Air Force officer. He was still removed by the military. So you must be very careful not to confuse the individual with the collective. And also to see that, as I said, the cabal can be quite small. That even in, for instance, the Libyan military in the 90s, you had officers from a tribe that allegedly was supportive of Gaddafi staging a coup against him. Right. So ultimately, it is the military cohesion or the military collective identity which will move people into power, which is more important than tribal or ethnic or sectarian identities. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And I'll end here.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really terrific. And I do think, actually, having just read this book and thoroughly enjoyed it, it gives our audience a pretty good sense of the general framework with which you approach these questions and some of the answers that you started to come up with. But I will say there's a lot more in here than that. So it's just an indication of the kind of approach that you took. And this is a very, very rich text. So I appreciate that very much. I have just a few observations that will serve as the basis for questions that I have for you, and we will quickly bring the audience in. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but I mean, I think you are right in noting the persistent popularity of Arab militaries, even, and as you say, irrespective of their performance as militaries, their performance as broader socioeconomic phenomena or institutions, and the role that they play politically. It's sort of, unless and until the military is overtly governing, as you point out, there is this sense of respect bordering on deference, and it's not universal, and it's not ever present, but it's typical. It's the sort of default. And so the question is, why is that the case? And I think you started to get at some of the reasons for that. In many of these cases, particularly in republics, in Arab republics, the militaries are identified with the nation. They are the one institution that is national, that is functional in many cases. That is, it's not a private institution. It's a public institution. It's a governmental institution. But first, they tend to function better than most other bureaucracies. They're funded better, and they have longer histories, and they are less amenable to becoming fiefdoms of personalities, unless it's a strong man, unless it's a caudillo figure who then becomes, it's sort of, it feels natural that would be a figure within a military. So it doesn't really break this aura. Then in addition, militaries, because conscription is frequently mandatory, brings together people from all over the social spectrum. So you've got different ethnicities, different sectarian groups, different social classes all coming together in this institution that often has more of a meritocratic edge than other bureaucracies. It's not going to be meritocratic, but there's more of it. And if you are a young man, and I think your gender reference was actually understated, because it's not usually men, it's always men who run these things in the Arab world. I can't think of an exception. I don't think there have been any. And I don't know when the first one will come, but young men in a hurry would frequently have few other reasonable options unless they have particular unusual opportunities in coming from their family in terms of business or some other social advantage. The military is an obvious place to go if you want to advance, if you want to join an effective institution and belong to the right club and be part of the mafia that's going to win. That would be a good place to go. So that then allows the military to be identified with the state in its better form, right? And with the flag and with all those things. And I think that there's a persistence of Arab national sentiment that's often underappreciated in the West. I think people have tended to think that Islamic identity or pan-Arab identity has trumped the national identities, but I think even the most cursory look at contemporary Arab politics reveals that national sentiment is still the dominant value at the political register, and the militaries are closely associated with that, especially insofar as they're not ruling. And so even in countries like Iraq and Lebanon, where the armies themselves are split, and where you could really make a case that these are not functioning the way I described as national institutions that are meritocratic and that bring people together from across the spectrum and all that, I think people tend to still think of them in those terms. And the Lebanese case is a very interesting one where in various different missions that the Lebanese army has taken part in recently, such as the one against Daesh recently and then others in Harad and things like that. But the public was really responsive to that. And again, it was irrespective of their performance. And it was sort of independent of any kind of judgment about how well they did and why they acted and where they did act. Now, but there are exceptions which are worth noting. I think it's very hard to make that case for the Syrian army right now. I think it's been a long time since the Syrian military is looked upon as any kind of national or integrative institution whatsoever. And also, in a less dramatic way, Tunisia is sort of a distinct example, because the mediating role that the military tends to play in other Arab societies, and you saw this with the downfall of Ben Ali and the emergence of the new sort of fledgling democracy in Tunisia, the role that you'd expect the military to play is actually performed maybe more by the UGTT or something like that. This large union actually serves that function in Tunisia. So it's just a particular thing. So this is not tout court, and it's not always the case. Militaries, as you say, don't want to rule directly, and I think Algeria is another good example of that. In Egypt is a good example where SCAF couldn't wait to get out of the running things business, and Sisi had to get out of uniform. He had to do the Castro thing very quickly, take the uniform off and put on a suit, as in late Castro and late Arafat also, as a kind of mark of respectability. But it's still the case that in Egypt, one of the big problems for the Egyptian elite that helped to undermine Mubarak before he fell was the prospect of his son succeeding him, his son who was not a former general, right? His son who was not part of the military. Unlike Mubarak, unlike Sadat, unlike Nasser, unlike any of the other plausible Egyptian leaders, having essentially extending the military's role into government. And this was considered a tasteless option for many reasons, but that was one of them. So I'd like us to think, and I'm going to ask you specific questions about this, some other ideas. To what extent, and well, I'll keep these actually as questions, and I'll just ask you them in a second. But let me just point out a couple of other anomalies, and I'll switch to questions. One is, the Palestinian case is a very interesting one, because the Palestinians don't have a state, and they also, therefore, don't have a military. The Israeli demand has been, you have to have, if you're going to have a state, it has to be demilitarized, right? Insofar as it's an Israeli demand, this has been very problematic for the Palestinian leadership. They don't want to agree to have a demilitarized state, non-militarized state, because the Israelis have demanded it, because it seems to be an infringement on their sovereignty. But since Oslo, the senior leadership of Fatah and the PLO has very quietly wanted to have a non-military state. They think in terms of Costa Rica. They don't want to spend their money on weapons and tanks and things that they won't use and that wouldn't win a fight against even a gendarmerie of Israel or even Lebanon. And it's just pointless. In addition to which, with the benefit of hindsight and not having had a military, you don't have to worry about coups if you're a politician, if you don't actually have a military. If you have a kind of hyper-empowered police force in the Costa Rican model, you don't have that issue. So for many reasons, the Palestinians would like not to get into this nexus. And it's conceivable that they will if they ever have a state. And you've got the opposite thing precisely happening with Hamas in Gaza, where in a sense, their experience with governance is proving to be unpalatable and frustrating and is not delivering for them politically. So that it's pretty clear that there's a big wing in Hamas that wants to keep the military part, the Qassam brigades, and keep the armed struggle going and keep their weapons and maybe even expand them, while jettisoning administration, while palming off the painful business of running Gaza on a day-to-day basis to somebody, anybody, right? And in that sense, they're looking to the last anomaly, which is Hezbollah, which again has kind of the same thing in Lebanon writ large, where the military angle is useful in a way that national political power is just seen as an albatross on that. So it's sort of almost the opposite of a lot of what you described. Having said all of that, I'm going to switch over to questions, and let me begin with this one, which is I want to talk about republics and monarchies in just a second, but the biggest picture question is, to what extent is this particular to the Arab world, and to what extent does it participate in a broader phenomenon of post-colonial states? So, for example, in much of Africa and other parts of Asia, et cetera, where states are weak, social institutions are weak, and militaries tend to be everything that we described, or at least I described at the beginning of my response. And that there is that, therefore, that unusual and perhaps anomalous role for militaries. That it's, to what extent is this particular to the Arabs or a broader post-colonial phenomenon? Let's start with that. And I got 2 or 3 more, and then bring in the audience.
I would have a lot of answers for you, actually. But can I just quickly say something about the popularity?
Of course.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, what I said earlier is, why are they so popular even when they're not very good at what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
Because, they're seen as a political arbiter.
Yeah.
Because they're not the police.
Yeah.
For most citizens, depending on the country, but for a lot of citizens in the Arab world, the main security force that they deal with on a daily basis is the police, which is usually very violent and corrupt.
Yep.
And the military is not. So just not being the police, that's already a good thing. Yep. Also not being political in the sense divisive, not sectarian. I think that's something that's really underappreciated, as you said, in Europe and in the US. This transnational symbolic nature of being really the representative of the nation and everybody, all the groups that are in the country. I mean, that's particularly the case in plural societies, but I think it's across the board. And was there something else? There is something else. There are 2 things. Well, on conscription, I think what's interesting is that, how we, at least in Europe, we stopped conscription pretty much across the continent in the 90s. And, being who we are, we thought everybody does what we do. Yeah. But in the region, there's been a rollback. So it's true that it was abolished, I think, in Lebanon 2005, and paused, I think, in Mauritania. But we see a return to conscription, especially in the Gulf, actually. Yeah. And very often it has less to do with manpower and more with symbolic reasons. So I think this sounds so old-fashioned and retro, but I think it is really that.
In the UAE in particular, it's part of an effort to create a national consciousness. Yes. And they say it. Yeah. I mean, this isn't interpretive. This is the policy.
And I think then there's one thing that in our post-heroic societies is maybe also not appreciated, is that when you join the military, you're ready to die for the state, right, and for the nation state in that sense. And I think people, it might be different in the US, but in Europe, I think that's something that's, nobody joins the military there thinking they will actually die for their job. In the region, you have a good chance of dying on your job. So I think there is really this recognition that you will die in the service of the nation. And I think that plays a role as well.
No, definitely.
And don't forget, I mean, in Lebanon, you can actually, there are military checkpoints. People drive up and say to the soldier, "Hello, nation."
Yeah.
Watan.
No, sure.
So this is a pretty powerful thing, I think.
Very.
Is this, your question really is the big philosophical question that every researcher working on this region has, namely, is the Middle East a region like no other or like any other?
Right.
So this is
the
a philosophical discussion. I'm part of the school that thinks that it's a region like any other. Obviously, it has its idiosyncrasies and specificities, but a lot of the material that went into this book is from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and I found the same features everywhere. Now, there is, of course, a certain Arab exceptionalism, but it's not when it comes to structure. And I'm fundamentally convinced that it's all about structure and state institutions. And in that sense, the military just is like every other military in the Arab world or in Latin America. So my answer would be it's a very typical structural reaction to the conditions of post-colonialism, of statehood, of issues of legitimacy that all tie into each other. Can I just add
anything at all?
two things because we are at the Arab Gulf States Institute after all. One military force that's been understudied is Saudi Arabia, and it's a really interesting case precisely because it's so understudied, but there is so much to it. It's very little known that there were actually, I think, 2 or 3 coup attempts against the monarchy. One of them actually was a collusion of princes with the military. They called themselves the Free Princes, like the free officers, but the Free Princes, and they were all served in the Saudi Air Force. And escaped when they were uncovered, escaped by plane to Cairo. So, I mean, we're talking about the 60s here. But there is, and that led into the government distrusting the potential political disruptive nature of the Saudi military. So, you probably heard a lot about how much money went into it, and yet they're still so inefficient and so forth. But I'm very curious to see how the interaction, the operation in Yemen will shape the Saudi military's outlook, because I think that it will shape them in one way or another. I think it has probably a cohesion-building effect, obviously also a huge learning curve in tactical terms and so forth. But it is a military force that deserves more study. And on Syria used to be the most political armed force, in the sense that nowhere were there more coup attempts and successful coups than in Syria, which counters this idea that when you have a plural officer corps, then you won't have a coup. Because that's one of the explanations for Lebanon never having had a coup attempt, that no group can actually control all of the Lebanese army. Well, in Syria, they didn't get the memo because they ousted each other regularly.
Yeah, almost annually.
Yeah, almost annually. So that, I think, proves still my point that ultimately it's a collective military mindset that operates, not a sectarian identity that tries to hijack the military.
Well, the other thing I'd like to ask you to talk about a bit more is, and this is sort of an issue that I don't think you tackle directly in your book, but you write around it a great deal, which is the extent to which, with the exception of Jordan and a little bit Saudi Arabia, though those coup attempts were complicated because a lot of them were linked to Egypt or some other outside force. They weren't necessarily entirely domestic. Most of this phenomenon of hyper-empowered, politically engaged militaries is a phenomenon of the Arab republics, much less than the Arab monarchies. Can you talk about the difference between the republics and the monarchies? And, well, I mean, you can, including saying I'm wrong about that.
Well, it's a good question because I would say I slightly disagree because you had, after all, several monarchies that were removed by the military.
Absolutely.
So
well, that's true, right?
Yeah, we have Egypt, we have Libya, we have Iraq. So I think that you have republics now where the military was strong enough to put an end to the monarchies.
Right. Gotcha.
But yeah, that notwithstanding, that happened a long time ago. But the monarchies we see today seem to be stable overall and also control the military, at least, or be in, let's say, in a situation where they don't want to remove each other entirely from the equation. But you are right in the sense that in the 60s, the military was seen as a revolutionary agent. We had it in Algeria, we had it in Libya, we had it in Egypt. But now they're more conservative or status quoist. I mean, there are different types of coup. So the revolutionary coup, we call it a breakthrough coup, when it really changes the government, so that the removal of monarchies. But most coups are what we call guardian coups, and that's why it's actually also called Guardians of the Arab State, in the sense that they change more the government, but not so much the political system. And Egypt 2013, or even Algeria in 1990, are examples of that, where the military intervened to preserve a status quo rather than to propel it into the future. And I think, for the moment at least, we're not in a revolutionary situation. We used to be. That was spelled the end of the monarchies. And today the military is much more conservative in that sense, that it seeks to preserve a certain situation.
Great. I have several more questions, but I want to bring the audience in right now. So let's we'll make a little semicircle here, beginning with Peter, and we'll go around. When you ask your question, if you can identify yourself, that would be great. I'm beginning. Where there's a mic. Okay, very good. So let's begin with Peter over here, and we can just sort of go around the table, and that will be easier on make the mic movement more logical. Go ahead, Peter.
My name is Peter Salisbury. I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk both this morning and now, and I look forward to reading the book. My question is this. In the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, we're seeing a real shift towards a kind of nationalist military security state model, which in many ways resembles the military republican model that we see elsewhere in the region. Given that you spent quite a lot of time talking about coups and the inherent risk of creating these structures to a regime, what advice would you give the leaderships of these countries while building their militaries to prevent, say, a coup attempt of some kind becoming successful?
And they're coup-proofing.
How do you coup-proof successfully?
How do you coup-proof successfully? Do I take one by one? Or?
Let's for now, let's go one by one. We might take a bunch later.
My studies and my experience and also conversations with Arab officers have shown me that it's essentially pretty much the same as everywhere else in the world, meaning that you need to engage constructively with the military, by listening to their strategic and tactical advice. Saddam Hussein, that's a really good example. Many people think that he actually served in the military because he appeared a lot in uniform, but he never did. He consistently ignored, during the Iran war, the advice of his officers. And they staged, I think, 2 or 3 attempts to get rid of him simply because they were down in the trenches paying the price. So that's the first thing. I don't know how the situation is exactly now in Saudi Arabia, but considering that they probably know better than you do, it's very worthwhile listening to what they have to say. The second thing is spending is never wrong. Like, the more you spend on your military force, the more likely they are to leave you alone. I think between 1960s and 70s in the region, when you had this spike of coups, the military spending increased by 15 times, where it remained stable in NATO countries. That was a reaction to the coups, and actually military spending goes up even after a failed coup attempt. So that's when the civilians realize we need to spend more on them or they're going to get really angry. The funny thing about this is that this doesn't have to go into salaries. On average, actually, you said social advancement. Yes and no, but it has more to do with symbolism than with money. I mean, depending on country, obviously in the Gulf they're better paid than in the Maghreb, but in the Maghreb, I think as a military officer you make between $400 and $1,000 a month.
That's not on the books, though.
That's, well, so there's, if you're in Egypt, maybe you make something on the side, but in Algeria, I think it's unlikely that you make something on the side. So spending, particularly on the force itself. So weapons procurement, training, and so forth.
Has there been an increase in defense spending in Turkey in the past 12 months?
Since then? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know, but I would guess yes. I would guess yes. After 2011 in the Gulf, the salaries for the officers also went up. I don't know if you noticed that. But it doesn't have to be salaries. I think it's also, don't forget to treat them as a collective. And so that goes into terms of weapons, but also allow them to train, allow them to perform in the way they do. And the last point, and I cannot stress this one enough because it's often underestimated. In Lebanon, every politician will seize the opportunity on Army Day to show up at the parade and to say how great the army is. Guess who didn't do that was the civilian leadership in Iraq. Never. Until 2014. Then obviously the divorce had been final. But there was no public support to the military to say, you're doing a great job, you know, no matter, even if they're doing a crap job. It's really important to honor and to honor their contribution and to encourage the institution to be what they are, which sounds a really odd thing to say because it's so symbolic and political, but it has increased in Iraq since Mosul fell, because there was this huge divorce between civilians and military leaders. And I think that symbolism, this, have an army day, have a tomb for the unknown soldier, things like that, they really do matter. So that would be, and the last point is on using non-punitive measures of control. That includes the Ministry of Defense, for it to actually be a developer of policy, not just a salary payer. But if you can, obviously in Saudi Arabia you don't have a parliament, but if you can have a certain forum where civilians and military leaders interact and talk about national defense, that's also something that is a non-punitive way to stay in touch with what they're actually thinking. Morsi's main mistake was that he was too separated from the military mind. He was not aware that just by promoting them and letting them be, that they were still harboring resentment against him. So too much separation is dangerous. You need to be really close to what they're thinking, but do it in a non-punitive way.
Excellent. So we're going to move down the line here. Well, then we skipped one, so, sir. Yeah. And then we'll go. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm Don.
No, it's fine. It's working.
I'm Don Picard with the Yemen Peace Project, and thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I'm curious about, especially with respect to the Saudi and Emirati militaries, what influence do you see on their connection with foreign states' militaries? For example, those two, with respect to their connections with the U.S. military, the training, the supplies, and so forth. Does that make a difference in their ability vis-a-vis the civilian governance of the state?
Interesting.
This is a often raised question. It was an often raised question in 2011 when the Egyptian and the Tunisian military facilitated the change of government, and then I was working in NATO at the time, and there were people who were actually saying, yeah, that's because we worked with them and we taught them what it's like to be a democratic military force, and then that disappeared in 2013. Awesome. Yeah. So I think what military training does is it definitely increases professionalism, but if the frustration in the officer corps in particular is there, then training will not make it disappear. In fact, it will increase your capacity to strike, like you saw in Egypt. So I wouldn't say training for a coup d'etat, but there is always a risk that if you contribute to the professionalization of the force without taking into account the wider political context and the frustration that might build in the military, that you're preparing them for a coup. Yeah.
Excellent. Oh. We keep going down the line here.
Hi, I'm Ricky Goldstein from Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much for your presentation. Perhaps this is in your book, but in your presentation, you didn't dwell on the economic activities of the military, particularly to like an exclusive domain by which they are able to enrich themselves. Egypt is the most glaring example, but one heard, at least in the past, about Algerian generals who had monopolies on spare parts, imports, and that kind of thing. To what extent is there data on the extent of economic activities by the military in different countries? Are there examples where civilian governments have tried to close this down or restrict it? And to what extent does this play a role in what you describe as there being guardians of the status quo?
Yeah, the second question is particularly relevant.
The status quo?
Work, yeah. No, to what extent have governments in the Arab world ever tried to pull back the economic role? But anyway, they're all good questions.
So it was Algeria, it was also Egypt, also Iraq and Syria. These are the 4 cases. Well, then you're going into a gray zone. In Jordan, there are lots of benefits for military officers, but it's not so much glaring economic activity. It's more like very, very discounted import rates on Mercedes, for instance. But that's not the same as actually allowing them as a collective to engage in business. So there is, we did a study at the UISS on Arab military industries, and we looked at Egypt. And it's very difficult because the system is so fragmented on purpose that you cannot really figure out how much they're actually making.
Yeah.
But we found in Egypt that when you look at the companies that work for the Arab, what's it called, Arab Production Organization, Military Production Organization or something like that, that they're producing articles that are not even dual use, but strictly civilian, like baby food, for instance. I mean, a TV screen, you could still argue, well, okay, maybe military needs TVs as well, but definitely not on baby food, on certain medicines, on certain fabrication of plastic, and so forth. What happens in general is that, so you do find data, but it's difficult to be sure about the amount of money they're making from it. In all 4 cases that I mentioned, essentially the government tried to tone frustration in the military down over financial restrictions by allowing them to engage in non-military activities. So the practice of the ghost soldiers in Iraq, for instance, you know, are you all familiar with the practice? Ghost soldiers is you have people on your payroll but they don't really exist, or maybe they exist but they never come to work. So the officer pockets half of the salary and the other half goes to the ghost soldier who never has to work in that sense. So that is a practice that dates back to the 1990s when Baghdad was under a lot of pressure, economically speaking, because of the sanctions. So in order to avoid a coup attempt, Saddam Hussein's regime allowed the military to get away with that. And it was a practice that survived, or that came back to the Iraqi army with the officers that came back. They were disbanded, but then a lot of them came back, actually. So where we do see it, it's a phenomenon of duress of the state. And therefore, states only suspend that practice when they have to pay a price for it. And that price is usually, as we saw in Iraq in 2014, a military price. Right. And that's, you will laugh, but the quickest way to change a military force or anything that's related to a military force is military defeat. So for instance, 1967, one of the many reasons that the Egyptian military didn't perform so well against Israel was because the force had been usually politicized by a struggle between Nasser and Amr, who is just chief of staff. Yeah. And the minute the military defeat happened, they realized, okay, we have to leave the army out of this because it's actually going to backfire. Right. So the only case that I know where it was actually suspended, this type of practice, was Iraq, but because Mosul fell. You also had it in Syria. They were particularly involved in production of certain items, but also in the construction sector. Construction sector, as you might know, is one of the corruptest sectors that there is. It's effectively only possible to suspend it either when the state itself recognizes that it could use the resources from somewhere else, which has never really happened in the region, or when it realized it's actually hurting itself in military terms, unfortunately.
Very good.
Thank you, Florence, for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about national conscription, especially now we're seeing a move in the GCC countries, some of them, to implement that, while other countries like Lebanon, lucky for me, I have to say, moved away from it. So kind of what's behind those 2 moves, especially the most recent ones in the GCC?
Well, there are different reasons for a state to decide to introduce conscription. The obvious one is manpower, need for manpower. So in Egypt, it's very much driven by this, and it's also the only case that I know of, at least in the region, where conscripts are actually sent into combat. I mean, you have recruits in Egypt that serve in the Sinai, and they die in the Sinai. So that's a really difficult practice, and I think there's also been well, first of all, it's obviously not possible to dodge the draft in Egypt. There is no such thing as, how do you say that in English? Objection de conscience?
Conscientious objection.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's almost the same. The second thing is the Emirati case. I think it might have to do with manpower, but it's already such a small state, it doesn't make that much of a difference. I think it's symbolic. And it's really intertwined with what you said, Hussein, earlier about, and actually, Karen, were the first one to talk about that, about this really pride of serving serving in the military, especially in the Air Force. So we have a bit of a comeback of the Air Force, as in the 60s. I think that's an important driver. In Lebanon, it was not suspended for the reasons it was suspended in Europe. In Europe, it was suspended because we thought we don't need big military forces, manpower-intensive forces, because number one, war is unlikely. We were wrong on that. Number two, military warfare will be different. It will be more specified, more cyber asymmetric, et cetera. Lebanon abolished it because it led to a brain drain, because the young men were exempted from the military service if they were gone for 5 years or longer. So they they left, and then of course what always happens is then you don't come back. Which led to, I don't know, is that a myth that in Beirut for every man there are 5 women?
What? Yeah, it's a myth.
It's a myth?
Yeah.
It's not a myth. Okay. Well, at least if it's a myth, it's a good myth. But it definitely contributed to the emigration of young men from Lebanon.
Yeah,
so I think it's a very interesting observation to see it coming back in the Gulf. Not just in the Gulf, I think also in Mauritania it was suspended, brought back. Same for Yemen, I think it was suspended at some point, then reintroduced. I think the link between the military and the societies is just a lot stronger than we, at least in Europe, first thought.
Apparently it's not a myth.
It's not a myth. Oh, did
Apparently
you
not.
it?
I did, at New York Times. But anyway, let's keep going down the line. We have the gentleman here. And, I mean, didn't look like 5 to 1 to me. But yeah, but it didn't look 5 to 1 to me. That's a lot.
I'm Jared Mason. I cover the region for the U.S. Treasury Department. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. I have 2 questions, actually. The first is kind of continuing to think about impact of economics on coups. What did you find in terms of, when you're talking about military intervention, you talked a lot about kind of sense of grievance and historical incidents of kind of feeling embarrassed or abandoned by the government. What about responding to economic situations, and what did you find for the propensity of coups for that reason? And then the second thing that I wanted to ask about was how changing technology and communications changed the mechanics of coups. Because you mentioned, kind of the classic playbook of taking over the radio station being, one of the major things that you do, and that doesn't seem as relevant anymore. So I'm curious what you see kind of in the last 20 years and how that's changed the way that coups take place.
Right,
Yeah.
but media is still relevant.
Yeah,
So yeah,
of course, right.
Yeah, please.
So what I found is that, number one, military forces don't act when the economy is bad. That's not one of their motivations. You would think that perhaps from the outside because it's what bothers people, but when the economy is bad and there's a lot of social unrest and the military already has its own grievances, then it might act. But the economic environment itself is not so interesting for the military. However, a coup always has negative consequences in economic terms. On average, GDP shrank by 3.5% in the region after a coup, and it takes a while to recover. That is because it stifles economic activity, it creates uncertainty. Usually military forces are also, in economic terms, not exactly progressive.
Right.
They create more red tape than they actually undo it. So that ties into this, what I said earlier about the military is liked, but military rule is not. Because once they're in power, they actually don't change things for the better, especially not the economy. And I think Egypt is a case in point. To go back to the question on Egypt on economic activity, what happened after 2013 is that the Egyptian military, which was already very active in economic terms, actually outcrowded civilians in the private sector. So I don't know if you follow this, but last year, I think, the Egyptian army ran ads mobilizing against monopolists, which drive up the price for baby milk and powder and things like that, and encourage people to go and buy their supplies in the army-run supermarket. So in no time, we will have no private sector left in Egypt. I mean, in terms of numbers, the guesses, what the military's share is in the economy in Egypt go anywhere between 5 and 60%. I mean, you know, you're dealing with Egypt, so obviously the guesses are quite broad. But the number notwithstanding, we do see that in economic terms, the military is controlling things or has gotten the, well, if there ever was a call for tender for the new Cairo, for the Suez Canal, for all kind, and then up in the Nile Delta, it's in tourism. Anything essentially that could be of civilian interest is now in military hands. It's one of the reasons why Egypt is not recovering economically. It's still not back to the level of where it was before 2011. So while you might be inclined to think that at least the military creates stability, hence that's good for the economy, it's actually not the case. For the economy, military rule is usually bad news.
What about the media issue?
Sorry. Thank you for this, for the radio. That always makes people laugh when we talk about the radio. So what happened the funny thing about that is that the situation is changing extremely fast. In 2013, when Morsi was ousted, Egypt was not as online as it is today. Even this whole, Facebook created the Arab Spring. That's a bit simplistic because neither Egypt and Libya, even less so, were actually online. I think 6% of Libyans were online in 2011. So what happened in 2013 was that the Egyptian military surrounded the presidential palace. Morsi posted a last item on his website, and that was later taken down. But as the example of, it's not the Arab world, but what the example of Turkey shows is that the Turkish officers underestimated, obviously, FaceTime and the impact it can have. It will be. But the learning curve
Facebook?
is FaceTime.
FaceTime.
He called via FaceTime.
I see what you mean. I see. So instant communication.
Instant communication. He didn't need
a
a camera. He could, with his iPhone, call live a news station and broadcast.
Gotcha.
Okay, you still needed TV in
I
old-fashioned terms, but he could have put it on Instagram as well, or on Facebook, or anywhere he liked. So that is something that future putschists will have to keep in mind. Either they shut down the internet completely, but as we've seen in 2011, that doesn't really work either. Plus, you have the rest of the world, which doesn't go offline just because you do. So you have to act extremely fast. And that is one of the reasons why coups happen, well, obviously usually at night, but also in summer. I think the vast majority of coups happen in summer. Why? Because you can move quicker through the streets with your tanks, because there's less people there. There are less people in the city that could actually stop you from acting. Oh God, now I sound like I'm giving you hints on how to do this.
Those books exist. Okay.
But that doesn't make it impossible. You just need to keep in mind, and you need to be the first one on the record with your message. And that's that's
communique number one.
That's communique number one, and it goes back to that. They were not in Turkey. Actually, Erdogan was faster than they were. But they were, the Egyptian case is interesting insofar as the Egyptian military announced 48 hours before that they would do it. So why Morsi just thought that he would get away with that, I don't know. But it will play a role in the future. I think we'll see it will become more sophisticated in that sense. They probably have a communique number one all over social media before anyone.
Tweet number one.
Tweet number one, yes.
Very good. I've got a question that's come in via email from someone who's watching live stream, so that's great, which is, to what extent, you mentioned about the relative public trust in the military in the Arab world. To what extent can that apply to militias, particularly Hezbollah and especially the Iraqi Shia militias, he asks.
Is it Adli?
It's Adil.
Adil. Thank you, Adil, from afar. That's a really good question.
Isn't it? Excellent.
Yes, it's a really good question because I've written down earlier what you said about Hezbollah. I thought I hope we can get back to Hezbollah.
Yeah, by all means.
You might know that in Lebanon in particular, there's always this, the Lebanese Army is weaker than Hezbollah, and Hezbollah can take over the army in no time, etc., etc. I could not disagree with that statement anymore. for two reasons. Firstly, yes, Hezbollah, and I'll come to the PMF and the others in a second. Hezbollah is a capable fighting force, we've seen that, but it is firstly much smaller than the Lebanese army, about it's probably 5% of the size. I don't know exactly, what it is, but it is much smaller. The second thing is that it doesn't have the same military capacities. I mean, it does something, a lot of people say the Lebanese army and Hezbollah are actually more complementary than in competition, because Hezbollah does a lot more, well, it has evolved in Syria, but it does a lot more guerrilla asymmetric warfare, whereas the Lebanese army does classical
Conventional
stuff.
Yeah.
So, and it has an air power. The Hezbollah does not have air power.
Yeah.
So that there will always be, and that brings me to the others, or to the more fundamental question, there will always be, and there is an inherent rivalry or, let's say, hostility between non-state military or armed actors and the official military force, which for us civilians is sometimes puzzling, because we always call for them to be integrated into each other, all the guys with guns in one place, and then everything is good. De facto, wherever you try that, it fails because of this inherent rivalry. Military forces, even if they're really bad at their job, have a strong sense of collective identity, of meritocratic principles, even if they're bad at it, of cohesion, of national interest, and so forth. Whereas the militia represents sectarian, particular interests, no civilian supervision, no command structure, no doctrine. I mean, it's really, when you superficially they might look similar, but when you look inside, they're actually not the same. Yeah. And so, if you look at the PMF now in Iraq, the Iraqi army is not happy. At least that's my impression. I was actually in Baghdad 2 weeks ago. I had the impression that the officers were not happy with this legitimization or the legal framework that was created for the PMF to make them nominally part of the Ministry of Defense, because of this inherent rivalry. But the question that was asked was, could these militias stage a coup? And the answer is no, they cannot.
No, I don't think that was exactly the question, but I would like the answer. You've posed a good question, so do finish it, and I'll rephrase it.
Well, so number one, they're very different, and they don't like each other.
Right.
But number two, can they stage a coup? And my answer is no, they cannot. Firstly, because they're usually a lot smaller.
Right.
Secondly, because they don't have all the equipment. They don't have the same level of signals. They don't have tanks. You need tanks to actually block off a presidential palace and so forth. Most importantly, they don't have the pull factors of the society around that. There is no broad societal consensus on the militias in the way there is on the military forces.
This was the question.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
The
so
question was how
Hezbollah,
much credibility can a non-state actor like Hezbollah or the PMF capture the popular imagination the way that a national army can?
Yes. No, they cannot.
Okay.
And that's why all the fears of Hezbollah taking over the Lebanese army or the Lebanese state are vastly overstated. Because Hezbollah, and I think Hezbollah doesn't even want that, because
They don't want it.
they're much better off where they are now than they would be in such a case.
They definitely don't want it.
But these fears, the question is a pertinent one, because it's particularly raised in Iraq when it comes to the PMF. But luckily, the PMF are so fragmented.
Yeah.
There are so many of them, and they have many different political agendas, that they're not the same as the body of the Iraqi army that you can move using certain officers and for collective violent action. So they are a problem, but not in that sense.
Oh, very good, thank you. We have, we've got Steve and then, okay, so we've got three more. Why don't we take them, let's combine them, and then you can answer all three, and begin with Steve, then we'll go to Yerevan, and then
Thanks very much, Florence. It's been a fascinating discussion on a great subject. And my question has to do with the internal dynamics of the rank and file of the armed forces that are called upon by their leadership to execute these coups. You said there's a collective military identity that subsumes political or tribal loyalties and kind of pulls them along. But I wonder if in your research, if the coups you examined that failed, did they fail because of a lack of internal cohesion, because that failed, and that you didn't get that discipline or the fear or whatever it is that motivates the foot soldiers, if you will, to step in line and salute and go forward?
That's a really good question. It also dovetails with the earlier distinction you made. Just keep in mind as we're moving the mic, the distinction between coups done by the top leadership versus the colonels. You mentioned that a lot of coups are done by colonels. And in Turkey, we just saw an example of a coup attempt where a lot of the senior leaders were not on board. So
yeah.
it's an interesting, you can meld all that in. Go right ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I totally agree that PMF is not able to stage a coup, like, militarily. But I think they have really good shot to come to power through election, especially in the upcoming election in April of 2018. So if especially Maliki is already working very closely with them, even though Maliki failed the Iraqi army, but I think he's trying to come back to power through PMF and PMF.
And that would include the Badr Corps, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely,
So
yes.
Hadi Amari and
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, exactly. So even though there are certainly problems, people probably do not like them, but they have legitimacy in the eye of the Iraqi people, and they are very credible. They were seen as a very good force in countering and defeating ISIS. So my question is, if PMF would be able to come to power, how would that impact civilian military relations in Iraq?
Okay. And
That's a
last
good
question
question.
here, yeah?
Hi. So I suppose you left Turkey outside. You're not talking about
Yeah.
Turkey, right? So
Yeah,
Right.
but I can still comment on Turkey if you want.
cool. So my question is, like from the title of the book, it looks like you're making a case about the Arab world, which makes it look as though it's a special case. So is it the case, or is it you left Turkey out just because it's not in the Arab world? And then my other question is, compared to Turkey, if you look at Turkey, most of the time, the reason behind the coup is ideological. How does that correspond with the causes behind coups in the Arab world?
Okay, so we have three questions. What about the rank and file and the cohesion of a coup plot? What about the potential for groups like PMF or others to come to power through politics rather than through coups? And what about ideology as a factor in coups?
Okay. Now, the rank and file, they are very, very rarely themselves coup stagers. Very extremely. I mean, I think I know one case in Nigeria in '67. The vast majority are orchestrated by the officers, but of course, I think what you're alluding to is where the soldiers then just refuse to go along with it. That has happened, but then I wouldn't call it a coup. I call it, more disintegration, or another form of collective disobedience, which we have seen, particularly in Libya after 2011, in the war of 2011, when large parts of the Libyan military just went home. Also in Syria, so it's if you want, it's the negative counterpart of a coup, because disintegration for a military force is a death certificate, because it means that you don't even have enough cohesion to do something like this. So we have seen that, Iraq, Libya, and parts of Syria, the Syrian army at the beginning of the conflict. But that once that it had hemorrhaged out those that weren't particularly on board, it actually stopped. I don't know if you remember this, but in 2012, there were all these wildly exaggerated expectations that the Syrian army is about to collapse because we have people defecting on a daily basis. But that ignored that most of the people that defected were rank and file,
Right.
not officers. And the officers are the bones, the skeleton, and the soldiers are the meat, so to speak. So as long as you have the bones, the body will still move. I mean, the Syrian army is in a horrible state, but the officer corps is still pretty much standing, and they just replaced the rank and file with others.
You can keep a lot of rank and file in barracks.
Yeah.
I mean, which they did in Syria.
Yeah.
A lot
But
of
it-
people
but
who are not called on to fight.
What is really interesting in every case that I have studied is that the relationship between the officer and the rank and file is it's almost it's utter obedience, regardless pretty much of what they ask you to do. In the civil war, it might be a different story because there's a lot of violence involved, and it's the most traumatic experience for a military force. But for a coup, it was very rare that a unit would actually rebel against the decision to act. But it depends. Turkey is a case in point. In Turkey, you did see actually units rebelling against their officer also. So it can happen, but it's not as often as you think. Also because they're trained to not question.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes even with violent means.
Right.
Actually, I heard that in Iraq the other day, where an officer told me, well, the first thing you do, you learn. He arrived at the military academy, and the commanding officer showed him a stick of wood and said, well, number one rule here is you obey whatever I say is correct. Is this made from wood or from metal? And he said, it's wood. He said, no, it's metal. And then he hit him, and he said, no, this is metal, even if it's wood, but I say it's metal, and your job is to just accept whatever I say. He said, okay, point taken. So it's quite coercive, I would say, but they're trained to stop thinking for themselves.
Yeah.
The PMF, the scenario that you describe is pretty much a nightmare scenario. Actually, it would be a scenario where I would expect the Iraqi army to stage a coup. Because the PMF, in the same way that I think that's often overlooked, that the situation in Libya today, in parts, has to do with the rivalry between the militias and whatever was left of the Libyan army after 2011. I don't know how familiar you are with this political isolation law that was enacted in 2013, that was much further, would have gone much further than de-Baathification, and it would have hit the Libyan military even harder, because it would have removed almost any officer that was left. There wasn't that much left, and those that were left, they would have been punished by this law. So behind Haftar, you have, amongst other things, the leftovers of the Libyan military, and against them, the Libyan militias who want to be the Libyan military. They don't want to integrate into the Libyan military. They want to replace it in the same way that some in the PMF dream of replacing the Iraqi army. So the situation that you describe, I would expect the PMF to want to replace the Iraqi army, or to at least become the dominant force in the security sector. And then my conclusion would be that the Iraqi army would not be able to accept that. And I think that's there is enough left in the Iraqi army of cohesion and collective identity, especially because the officer corps is largely made up of people that have been working there since the 70s, that I think they would not accept that. And I hope that your scenario will not come true. Turkey, well, you know, I mean, it's called, I'm an Arabist, so that's why it has nothing to, as I said about to Hussein earlier, I think the region is not an exception. I think the same features apply. I wrote, after the coup in Turkey, I wrote a brief called Coup d'etat, a very short introduction, which was very much taking these insights into the Turkish territory, and they are pretty much the same features. I think what played into the decision of the Turkish military to act last year was, well, the military action in northern Syria, where I think they were not happy with the turn this was taking, how the government was supporting the Islamists, and also the fight against the PKK. So this was what I described earlier, when you don't take their advice, or you make them do things that they really don't think you should be doing, then, you know, watch out. In addition, well, we know now that Ankara already had a list of people they wanted to get rid of before the coup, and the putschists knew that, and they decided to act before they would be removed from.
But too quickly.
But they miscalculated. Ideology plays a role more in the mobilization than I think in the actual coup. It plays a role in how the officers will connect to each other. To stage a coup, the first thing you need is to form a group of plotters that trust each other. Because if you have one infiltrator, the whole thing goes bust. So ideology will play a role in creating that cohesion and the trust. So you saw that, I don't know, in Nasser and all these circles. Later on, I think to actually execute the coup, I think ideology might play a role, but it's one of the many other reasons. And of course, in the Turkish military, nationalism is by itself a very strong component, so that probably played a role, but along with other reasons, I think. But Turkey could very well be in this book as well.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for a great presentation. And do you have any closing thoughts for us? Because we're about to end, and I'm just if you'd like to wrap it up, that'd be great.
I think I hope this came through my remarks, that ultimately I feel very passionately about Arab military forces, and I don't see them as the enemy, which you know, I now work for the EU, which has its issues with engaging with military actors. But I do think that it's mainly an institutional phenomenon, and that you have to work with them. And I think the case of Iraq shows this very, very clearly. I wrote a publication 2 years ago about what happened in Iraq, and I called it An Unhappy Marriage, Civil-Military Relations. My original title was A Catholic Marriage, because a Catholic marriage cannot be divorced.
Right.
And civil-military relations, you cannot divorce them. You will always have to work with the military to actually achieve what is the objective of the relation, that is defense of the country. And I think, I wish that, inshallah, in the future, there are more constructive civil-military relations in the region that will achieve that objective.
That's great, thanks. By the way, while we were talking, I did check to see if you were right about Turkey, and you're quite right. The Turkish defense spending for after the coup, so for 2017 and 2018, is going up, depending on different sources, between 9 and 11%.
Wow.
Up to about $10 billion. It's 1.25% of GDP. But what Jane said is those figures don't reflect extra budgetary resources allocated on Syria and things like that. So it's actually more. So you're quite right. And your analysis, as always, holds. So thank you so much. And please join me in thanking our guest. She was absolutely great.